On a bitter winter night in 1878, a woman with an empty stomach and a stolen identity waits for morning, knowing one lie could lead her either to a new life or a grave in the cold Texas dirt. She expects judgment. She expects rejection. What she does not expect is Silas Thorne, a rugged, silent rancher who brings bread, ham, honey, and something far rarer than food: respect. As danger closes in and the truth begins to surface, two wounded souls discover that love in the West is not born from perfection, but from courage, mercy, and the decision to stand together when the storm comes.
The wind didn't just blow in Rattlesnake Flats, it bit. It was December 1878, and the Texas winter was a lean, mean animal. I sat at the small pine table. My coat was buttoned to the chin. I kept my gloves on. The cabin was a drafty thing, full of gaps that let the moonlight and the frost crawl inside. On the table sat a single crust of bread. It was 3 days old. It was hard as a river stone. I looked at it. My stomach didn't even growl anymore. It had gone quiet, a hollow ache that reached all the way to my bones. I reached out and touched the bread, but I didn't eat it, not yet. Once it was gone, there was nothing else. I looked at my hands. They were thin. My skin was pale as milk. "Being poor isn't a sin," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it sounded loud in the empty room. Society wants to believe that if you have nothing, you are nothing. They want to think that a person without money is a person without a soul. But they are wrong. Hunger doesn't strip a woman of her dignity. It only reveals the steel beneath the skin. I needed to say it. I needed to hear it. Because tomorrow, I was going to walk into town and tell a lie that would change everything. I pulled the letter from my pocket. It was crumpled. I knew the words by heart. My photographic memory wouldn't let them go, but I needed to see them. To Abigail Thorne, it began. It was an invitation to a life I didn't own, a 40% stake in the Star Thorne Ranch. It was meant for my cousin, Abigail, who had passed away in a cold room in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago. Abigail, who had someone to mourn her. I had no one. I had no money. I had no future. I looked at the bread again. "Poverty is a circumstance," I told the shadows. "It is not a character flaw. A person's worth isn't measured by the coins in their purse, but by the resilience they show when the world tries to starve them out. I have a right to survive. I have a right to a place in this world, even if I have to walk through a lie to get to the truth of it." That was the educational truth of my life. The world looked at a woman in a tattered dress and saw a failure. I looked in the mirror and saw a survivor. I picked up the crust of bread. I took a small bite. It tasted like dust and desperation. I thought about the man I was supposed to meet. Silas Thorne, my cousin. He was the one who owned the other 60%. He was the one who would look at my face and see a stranger. I had to be perfect. I had to be Abigail. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Texas plains stretched out forever. It was a big, empty land. It was beautiful, and it was cruel. It didn't care if you lived or died. "Tomorrow," I whispered. I blew out the candle. The darkness was heavy. It was cold. But as I lay down on the hard cot, I didn't feel weak. I felt sharp. I was Sarah Jane Miller. I was a school teacher with no school. I was a woman with no food. But I was still a woman with a mind. And in the West, that was the only thing that ever really mattered. I was going to find my feast one way or another. I was going to prove that human dignity doesn't have a price tag. I closed my eyes and waited for the morning. It was a long time coming. The storm didn't just arrive, it invaded. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the cabin walls. It sounded like a choir of ghosts. I huddled by the fireplace, feeding at the last of the kindling. The heat was a small, fragile thing. It didn't stand a chance against the Texas frost. Then I heard it. A horse. No one in their right mind was out in this. I stood up. My legs were shaky from hunger. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. The door didn't creak. It groaned. A man stepped inside. He was tall. He was wide. He was covered in a thick layer of white snow. He looked like a statue carved out of ice. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me. He just turned around and shouldered the door shut against the gale. I stood there frozen. My heart was a drum in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice was thin. The man didn't answer. He moved to the table. He dropped a heavy burlap sack onto the pine wood. It landed with a thud that echoed in the quiet room. He reached up and pulled back his hood. His hair was dark. His beard was trimmed close. His eyes were the color of the earth after a heavy rain. He looked at me then, just for a second. There was no judgment in his gaze. There was no anger. There was only a deep, settled quiet. This was Silas Thorne, the man I was supposed to be related to, the man I was currently lying to. He walked to the hearth. He took the fire poker from my hand. He didn't snatch it. He just took it. He stoked the flames until they roared. Then he went back to the bag. He started pulling things out. A thick slab of smoked ham, a loaf of bread that was still soft, a jar of golden honey, a tin of coffee. I forgot to breathe. The smell of the ham hit me like a physical blow. It was salty. It was rich. It was life. Silas took a knife from his belt. He sliced the meat. He put it in a cast-iron skillet he found by the fire. The sizzle was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I watched him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to thank him. And I wanted to run away because I didn't deserve a single bite of what he was cooking. "You didn't have to do this," I whispered. Silas flipped the ham. He didn't look up. A few minutes later, another figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman. She was older. Her hair was a shock of silver beneath a wool shawl. She stepped in and closed the door with a firm hand. This was Martha, Silas's mother. She looked at the table. She looked at the food. Then she looked at me. She didn't see Abigail Thorne. I knew it the moment our eyes met. She saw a girl from the city who was trying very hard to pretend she wasn't terrified. Martha walked over to me. She didn't hug me. She just put a hand on my shoulder. Her palm was warm. It felt like a benediction. "Sit down, child," Martha said. Her voice was like smooth river stones. I can't pay for this," I said. I felt the lie sticking in my throat. Martha pulled out a chair for me. She waited until I sat. Then she looked me dead in the eye. "Listen to me, Sarah Jane, or whoever you are tonight," Martha said. She didn't whisper. She said it plain. "A person's right to eat is not a privilege granted by the wealthy. It is not something you earn with a name or a title. It is a fundamental respect for the breath inside a human body. When a soul is hungry, the only moral response is to feed it. To withhold food as a way to judge a person's worth is a sin against the very idea of humanity. You are a person. You are alive. That is the only reason we need to be here." I felt the tears then. They were hot. They tracked through the dust on my cheeks. Silas placed a plate in front of me. 2 thick slices of ham, 3 pieces of bread, a puddle of honey. "Eat," he said. It was the first word he had spoken. It was deep. It was like thunder in the distance. I picked up the bread. I dipped it in the honey. I ate until the hollow ache in my stomach started to fade. I ate until I felt the blood moving in my veins again. Silas didn't watch me. He sat across the room cleaning his knife. He was a silent sentinel. He didn't ask for my story. He didn't ask for the truth. He just provided the feast. I realized then that the West was a place of high stakes. It was a place where a lie could get you killed. But it was also a place where a silent man and a silver-haired woman believed that no one should ever have to face the winter alone. I was an imposter. I was a thief of a legacy. But for the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not as a teacher, not as a cousin, but as a human being who had been cold and was now warm. I looked at Silas. He caught my eye. He gave a small, almost invisible nod. The storm was still screaming outside, but inside the cabin the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a house that was becoming a home. The snow stayed. For 3 days the world was white. The drifts were as high as the windows. We were trapped in that small cabin, Silas, Martha, and me. Silas didn't leave. He slept on a bedroll by the door. He was up before the sun. He would clear the snow from the porch. He would check the horses in the lean-to. He moved with a purpose that didn't require conversation. I spent the time with Martha. She taught me things. How to keep the sourdough starter alive. How to mend a heavy wool coat. How to listen to the wind to tell if the storm was breaking. But mostly I looked at the books. The Starthorn Ranch had ledgers. Silas brought them in from the main house before the snow got too deep. He spent his afternoons sitting at the table staring at columns of numbers. He looked like a man trying to read a foreign language. I watched him. My photographic memory was a restless thing. I could see the pages from across the room. I could see the errors. On the third afternoon, I couldn't stay quiet. "The livestock count is off," I said. Silas stopped. He didn't look up immediately. He just froze with his pen over the paper. He turned his head slowly. "Off?" "On page 14, I said. I didn't move from my chair. "You carried over 300 head of Hereford cattle from October, but the feed receipts on page 16 only account for 280. There's a gap. Either 20 cows went missing or someone is charging you for feed you never received." Silas looked at the book. He flipped the pages. He went back and forth, his brow furrowed. He looked at me again. This time there was a spark of something else in his eyes. Respect. "I didn't see that," he said. "I see patterns," I said. "It's how my mind works." He pushed the ledger toward me. He didn't say anything. He just leaned back and crossed his arms. I spent the next 2 hours going through the books. It was a mess. Not because Silas was lazy. It was because he was a man of the earth and the books were a man-made cage. I saw where the money was leaking. I saw where the deputy, Caleb Vance, had been signing off on administrative fees that didn't make a lick of sense. Silas watched me work. He didn't hover. He just sat there, carved out of stone. Finally, I closed the book. I looked at him. "You're being cheated, Silas," I said. "I suspected," he said. He rubbed his face with a calloused hand. "Vance says it's the cost of doing business in the flats. Says the law requires a lot of paperwork." "The law shouldn't require theft," I said. I looked at Martha. She was knitting by the fire. She looked up at us. "Work is the great equalizer, Sarah Jane," Martha said. She put her needles down. "In the city, they tell you that a woman's place is in the parlor, and a man's is in the field. They tell you that a man who works with his hands is beneath a man who works with a pen. But that is a lie designed to keep people in their place." She stood up and walked over to the table. She put one hand on Silas's shoulder and the other on mine. "True equality comes from understanding that every labor is essential," Martha continued. "Silas knows the language of the grass and the cattle. You know the language of the numbers and the law. Neither of you is more important than the other. A ranch cannot survive without the fence mender, but it also cannot survive without the record keeper. To believe that one type of work is superior is to disrespect the dignity of the person doing it. You both bring a tool to this table. That makes you equals. And in this land, equality is the only thing that keeps the vultures away." Silas looked at his hands. They were scarred. They were stained with oil and dirt. Then he looked at my hands. They were ink-stained and soft. "She's right," Silas said. He looked at me, not as a cousin, not as an intruder. He looked at me as a partner. "I can't fight Vance with a ledger. I only know how to fight him with a horse and a rope, but you see things I don't." "I see the truth in the numbers," I said. "Then show me," Silas said. We sat there for the rest of the night. He told me about the ranch. He told me about the drought of '76. He told me about the way the grass turned gold in July. I told him about the math. I showed him how Caleb Vance was squeezing the Starthorn. We were building something. It wasn't a romance, not yet. It was something more solid. It was a bridge of mutual respect. The blizzard was dying down outside. The world was going quiet. I realized that I was still lying about my name. I was still Sarah Jane Miller, hiding inside Abigail Thorne's skin. But as I sat there with Silas, I felt a different kind of honesty. I was contributing. I was protecting the land that Silas loved. I was using my mind to preserve the feast he had brought me. "You're a strange woman, Abigail," Silas said. He said the name carefully. "The West is a strange place," I replied. He didn't laugh. He just gave that small ghost of a nod. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to town. We show Vance that the Starthorn has two sets of eyes now." I felt a shiver of fear, but I also felt a surge of pride. I was a woman who had been starving 3 days ago. Now I was a woman who was essential. I was learning that in Texas, dignity wasn't just about surviving. It was about being the person who stood in the gap when the wind started to howl. I looked at the ledger one last time. The numbers were clear. The path was set. We were going to fight. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting alone. The thaw came on a Tuesday. It wasn't a gentle thing. The ice groaned. The eaves dripped like a slow-beating heart. The world turned from white to a muddy, bruised gray. Silas was out early. He was checking the fences. He was checking the stock. I was in the kitchen with Martha. We were scrubbing the pine floor. My back ached. My hands were red from the lye, but the work felt honest. It felt like I was paying my rent in sweat. "You have a gift, Sarah Jane," Martha said. She didn't look up from her scrubbing. "You remember the numbers, you see the gaps. Most folks go through life with their eyes half shut. They see what they want to see. They don't see what is actually there." I dipped my brush in the bucket. The water was gray. "Sometimes I wish I could forget," I said. "A mind that keeps everything is a crowded house. There is no room for peace when every mistake you ever made is still sitting in the front parlor." Martha stopped. She sat back on her heels. She wiped her forehead with her apron. "Listen to me," she said. Her voice was firm. "The value of a human being is not found in their perfection. It is found in their utility to others. You think your memory is a burden because it reminds you of your hunger. I think it is a miracle because it can protect this ranch. Having a skill is a responsibility. To hide a talent out of fear is to deny the world the help it needs. That is a truth you need to swallow. We are given our strength so we can be a shield for those who have none." I nodded. I understood. But the guilt was still there. It was a cold stone in my belly. That afternoon, Silas asked me to ride out with him. He didn't ask with words. He just pointed to the extra horse and waited. We rode toward the creek. The air was sharp. The mud sucked at the horse's hooves. We stopped near a cluster of cottonwoods. Silas dismounted. He checked a heifer that had a limp. He was gentle. His hands were huge, but he touched the animal like it was made of glass. "I met her once," Silas said. He didn't look at me. He was still looking at the heifer. My heart stopped. I knew who he meant. "Abilene," he continued. 1870. The livestock fair. Abigail was selling books at a small stall near the livery. She was wearing a blue ribbon in her hair. She told me a story about a king who lost his crown in a well. He looked up then. His eyes were hard. They were searching my face. "I don't remember that king," I said. My voice was steady, but my soul was shaking. "She said something to me that day," Silas said. He stepped closer. The mud crunched under his boots. "She said, 'A name is just a sound we make to keep from being lonely. It's the heart that does the heavy lifting.' Do you remember saying that?" I looked at him. I could have lied. I could have made up a story. But I looked at his eyes and I saw the feast he had brought me. I saw the ham, I saw the honey. I saw the way he stood on the porch in the cold to keep me safe. "I remember the feeling," I said. "But the words belong to a different time. A person changes when they are starving, Silas. The woman you met in Abilene didn't know what it was like to watch her life turn to ash. The woman standing here does. Grief and hunger, they rewrite a person's history. They make the past look like a dream you had once but can't quite prove." Silas didn't move. The wind moved the branches of the cottonwoods. It was a lonely sound. "Trust is the only currency that matters out here," Silas said. He wasn't whispering. He was speaking to the horizon. A man can lose his cattle. He can lose his grass. But if he loses his word, he is just a ghost in a hat. To deceive a person is to steal their reality. It is a violation of their right to know the ground they are standing on. I need to know the ground, Sarah Jane. I need to know if the woman in my house is a partner or a predator. I felt the weight of his words. They were heavier than the snow. "I am a woman trying to survive," I said. "And I am a woman who will fight for this ranch because it is the first place that ever gave me a seat at the table. That is the only truth I have today." Silas watched me for a long time. Then he turned back to his horse. "Help me with this heifer," he said. He didn't say he believed me. He didn't say he forgave me, but he gave me a job to do, and in the West, a job was the beginning of an answer. The town of Rattlesnake Flats was a collection of crooked boards and broken promises. It smelled of wet wood and coal smoke. We rode in on Friday morning, Silas, Martha, and me. We went straight to the deputy's office. Caleb Vance was sitting behind a desk that was too expensive for a man on a lawman's salary. He had a gold watch chain. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas," Vance said. He stood up. He smoothed his vest. "And the lovely Miss Thorne. I trust the winter hasn't been too unkind to you." "The winter was fine," Silas said. It's the paperwork that's giving us trouble." Silas dropped the ledger on the desk. It hit with a heavy thud. Vance didn't look at the book. He looked at me. He looked at me like I was a problem he was trying to solve. "I've been looking over the accounts," I said. I stepped forward. I didn't wait for him to ask me to sit. I stood my ground. "There is a discrepancy," I continued. "A large one. $600 in protective tariffs paid to this office over the last 2 years. Plus another $400 in unpaid back taxes that don't appear in the county records I saw at the land office." Vance's smile didn't falter. It just grew sharper. "The law is a complicated machine, Miss Thorne," Vance said. "Ranchers know cattle. They don't always know the intricacies of the state's demands. I've been keeping the Starthorn afloat. I've been protecting Silas from his own ignorance." "The law is not a machine," I said. My voice was clear. It carried out into the street. "The law is a promise. It is a system meant to ensure that the strong cannot simply devour the weak because they have a faster pen or a shinier badge. When you use a position of power to strip a person of their property through deceit, you aren't administering the law, you are weaponizing it, you are committing a crime against the very idea of justice." Vance leaned back. He tapped his fingers on the desk. "Bold words for a woman who just arrived," he said. "Are you sure you want to start a war over a few numbers, Silas? Things can get very difficult for a ranch that isn't compliant." Silas stepped up beside me. He didn't draw his gun. He just put his hand on the back of my chair. It was a gesture of absolute solidarity. "She's not just a woman with words," Silas said. "She's the owner of 40% of that land, and she remembers every cent you took. We aren't here to negotiate, Vance. We're here to tell you that the window for stealing is closed." Vance's eyes went cold. The mask slipped. For a second, I saw the wolf beneath the skin. "Inheritance is a tricky business," Vance whispered. "Especially when the heir is someone nobody has seen in 10 years. People might start asking questions about who you really are, Miss Thorne. They might wonder if a fraud is trying to steal Silas's land right from under him." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a threat, a direct one. He was telling me he knew, or he suspected. But I thought about the lesson Martha taught me on the kitchen floor. I thought about the responsibility of a skill. "Justice is not a matter of identity," I said. I looked him straight in the eye. "Even if I were a ghost, the numbers would still be wrong. The theft is real. The exploitation is real. You are using the system to create a class of people who are perpetually in debt so you can profit from their ruin. That is a violation of the basic human right to own the fruits of one's labor. No man has the right to build his wealth on the calculated suffering of his neighbors. Vance stood up. He was shaking with a quiet, suppressed rage. "Get out," he said. We walked out of that office into the cold Texas sun. My heart was pounding. My hands were trembling. Silas led the way to the horses. He didn't speak until we were mounted. "You did well," he said. "He's coming for me, Silas," I whispered. "He's going to try to prove I'm a liar." Silas turned his horse to face mine. He reached out and took my reins. He forced me to look at him. "He can try," Silas said, "but he's going to have to walk through me to do it. And Silas Thorne doesn't move for wolves." We rode out of town. The Starthorn was waiting for us. It was a big land. It was a hard land. But as I looked at Silas's broad back, I realized something. The lie was a cage. But the truth, even a dangerous one, was a weapon. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just hiding from the storm. I was becoming the storm. We had declared war on the deputy. We had declared war on the lie. "Justice is worth the fight," Silas said as we hit the open trail. "Because without it, we're just animals fighting over a bone." I nodded. I didn't need to say anything else. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of a shared purpose. The feast Silas had brought me wasn't just ham and honey. It was the chance to stand up. It was the chance to be more than a victim. It was the chance to be a woman who demanded the world be better than it was. And as the sun began to set over the Texas plains, I knew I would never be hungry in that way again. The moon was a cold, white eye. It watched the Starthorn with a gaze that felt like a judgment. After that day in town, the air changed. It wasn't just the winter. It was the weight of what we had done. We had poked the wolf. Now we were waiting for the bite. I couldn't sleep. Every time a floorboard creaked, I saw Caleb Vance's smile. I saw the gold chain on his vest. I saw the way he looked at me. Like I was a knot he was going to untie, strand by strand, until there was nothing left but the truth. I got out of bed. I wrapped my shawl tight around my shoulders. I walked to the front door thinking I'd sit by the dying embers of the hearth. I opened the door. I stopped. Silas was there. He wasn't inside. He was out on the porch. He was sitting in a wooden rocker, his heavy sheepskin coat buttoned to his chin. His rifle, a Winchester that looked like it had seen every mile of Texas, was resting across his knees. He was looking out at the dark line of the horizon. He didn't turn around when I stepped out. He just stopped rocking. "Go back inside, Sarah Jane," he said. "It's too cold for you out here." I didn't go back. I walked to the railing and looked at him. His face was a map of shadows. "You can't sit out here all night, Silas," I said. "The storm is over, but the frost is still deep." "I'm fine," he said. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Caleb Vance is a bully, but he won't come in the middle of the night, not yet." Silas finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, but they were steady. He shifted the rifle slightly. "Listen to me," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, like a wagon on a dirt road. "Safety is not a gift that a man gives a woman because he's feeling generous. It isn't a favor I'm doing you because you helped with the books. Safety is a fundamental human right. It is the basic requirement for a person to live a life of meaning. When a man uses fear to keep a person quiet, he is stealing their peace. And I believe that every soul has a right to peace that no badge and no lawman can legally take away." He paused. He looked back at the darkness. "I am sitting here because I believe in that right," he continued. "I am sitting here because the moment we allow a predator to make a person afraid in their own home, we have lost the very thing that makes us civilized. I'm not just guarding a door. I'm guarding your right to exist without looking over your shoulder. That is a value worth more than any acre of this land." I felt a lump in my throat. I had spent my whole life being told that I was a burden. I had been told that my safety was something I had to earn by being quiet, by being useful, by being invisible. But Silas saw it differently. He saw my safety as a truth that existed because I existed. "Thank you," I whispered. Don't thank me for doing what's right, Silas said. Just go to sleep. A mind as sharp as yours needs rest if we're going to find the rest of those gaps in the ledger. I went back inside. I lay down. For the first time since Philadelphia, I didn't listen for the floorboards. I didn't watch the shadows. I fell asleep knowing that a silent man was standing between me and the wolf. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Silas was a shadow. He worked. He ate. He sat on that porch every night. He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't ask for a conversation. He just provided the protection. Martha watched us both. She was the glue. She kept the stove hot. She kept the coffee flowing. She saw the tension in my shoulders. She saw the way I looked at Silas when he wasn't looking. "He's a good man, Sarah Jane," Martha said one afternoon. We were hanging laundry. The wet sheets were freezing as soon as the wind hit them. "I know," I said. "He doesn't do it for the glory," Martha said. "He does it because he remembers what it's like to be the one who is left behind. He knows that the greatest cruelty isn't a blow to the face. It's the feeling that you are alone in a world that wants to eat you alive." She pinned a pillowcase to the line. "Remember this," Martha said, looking me in the eye. "Protection isn't about power. It's about responsibility. A man who uses his strength to shield others is a man who understands that power is a debt we owe to the vulnerable. Silas is paying that debt every night he sits on that porch. He's teaching you that you are worth protecting. And that is a lesson every person needs to learn before they can truly be free." I looked at the house. I looked at the porch. I was beginning to believe her. I was beginning to believe that I was more than a lie. I was more than a hungry girl in a stolen name. I was a person who deserved to be safe. But as the sun went down, I saw a dust cloud on the road. It wasn't the wind. It was riders. Caleb Vance was coming. And this time he wasn't bringing a smile. The riders stopped at the gate. There were 3 of them. Caleb Vance was in the middle. He was wearing a long black duster. He looked like a crow perched on a horse. Silas didn't move from the porch. He was already standing. He had the Winchester in the crook of his arm. He didn't point it. He didn't have to. "Evening, Silas," Vance called out. His voice was oily. It hung in the cold air. "Vance," Silas said. "I'm here on official business," Vance said. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "I've had some communication with the authorities back east. Philadelphia, to be exact. It seems there's some confusion about the identity of the woman staying under your roof." I was standing behind the screen door. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the frame. This was it. The wall was coming down. "The confusion is yours, Vance," Silas said. "Is it?" Vance spurred his horse forward a few steps. "Because the Abigail Thorne who lived in Philadelphia was reported deceased 3 weeks ago. Sickness, they say. Terrible thing. Which makes me wonder who this lady is that's been looking at my books." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look back at the door. "Identity is a matter for the courts, Vance," Silas said. "Not for a deputy with sticky fingers." "It's a matter of fraud, Silas," Vance shouted. "And I'm here to take her in for questioning. Step aside." Silas raised the rifle. The click of the hammer was the only sound on the ranch. It was loud as a gunshot. "No," Silas said. "You're obstructing justice, Thorne." "No," Silas said. His voice was like iron. "I am upholding the law. And the law says you need a warrant signed by a judge to take a person from their home. You don't have a warrant. You have a grudge. Now, turn those horses around before I decide that you're trespassing on private property." Vance glared at him. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the house. He knew he couldn't win a shootout. Not here. Not with the sun going down. "This isn't over, Silas," Vance spat. "I'll be back with the sheriff, and when I do, both of you are going to rot in a cell." He jerked his horse around. The 3 of them rode off, the dust swallowing them up. Silas stood there until the sound of the hooves died away. Then he lowered the rifle. He turned and walked into the house. I was waiting for him in the kitchen. I couldn't look him in the eye. "He's right," I whispered. Silas stopped. He put the rifle on the rack. "He's a thief, Sarah Jane," Silas said. "No," I said. I looked up then. The tears were coming. "He's right about the lie. Abigail is dead. I'm Sarah Jane Miller. I was her cousin. I was her friend. And when she died, I took her name because I didn't want to die in that cold room with her. I took her name because I wanted to eat. I took her name because I was a coward." The silence in the kitchen was heavy. It was suffocating. Martha was sitting at the table. She didn't say a word. She just watched us. "I lied to you, Silas," I said. "I lied to you from the moment I stepped off that train. I let you bring me food. I let you protect me. And all the time, I was a fraud. I waited for the anger. I waited for him to tell me to get out. I waited for the judgment." Silas didn't move. He just looked at me. "Honesty is a luxury that the starving can rarely afford," Silas said. I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. "Listen to me, Sarah Jane," Silas continued. He walked over to the table and sat down. He looked at me with a gaze that was almost painful in its clarity. "Society likes to pretend that truth is a simple thing. They like to say that a good person always tells the truth, and a bad person always tells a lie. But they don't know what it's like to have the wind howling through your ribs. They don't know that sometimes a lie is the only bridge between a person and their grave." He reached out and tapped the ledger on the table. "But here is the real truth," he said. "Honesty is not just about the name you give a deputy. It is about the intent of your heart. You lied to survive, yes, but you used that lie to do something honest. You used your mind to protect this ranch. You used your voice to demand justice for people you didn't even know. That is a deeper honesty than any name on a piece of paper." He stood up and walked toward me. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of me. "Honesty is the only thing that truly sets a soul free," Silas said. His voice was soft now. "As long as you were hiding behind Abigail, you were a prisoner of your own fear. But now you have spoken your true name. You have claimed your own history. And that, Sarah Jane Miller, is the most courageous thing a person can do. You aren't a fraud. You are a woman who finally decided that the truth was worth more than the safety of a lie. And I would rather stand with an honest woman named Sarah Jane than a ghost named Abigail." I looked at him. I saw the respect in his eyes. It was real. It wasn't for the cousin he thought he had. It was for me. "You aren't going to make me leave?" I asked. "I told you," Silas said. "I don't move for wolves, and I don't abandon my partners. You're a Miller. You're a teacher. And you're the best thing that's happened to the Starthorn in 20 years. Now wash your face. We have work to do." I looked at Martha. She was smiling. "He's right, you know," Martha said. "The truth is a hard thing to carry. But it's the only thing that doesn't get heavier the longer you hold it." I took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, the hollow ache in my chest was gone. I wasn't Abigail. I wasn't a shadow. I was Sarah Jane Miller. And for the first time, I felt like I had actually earned my place at the table. We sat down to dinner. It was simple, stew and bread. But it tasted like a victory. We knew Vance would be back. We knew the fight was just beginning. But as I looked at Silas and Martha, I knew that the lie was gone. We were standing on honest ground. And in Texas, that was the only ground worth fighting for. "Dignity is found in the truth," Silas said as he broke the bread. "And tonight, we are all dignified people." I nodded. I was ready for the morning. I was ready for the wolf. Because I finally knew who was looking back at me in the mirror. And she wasn't afraid anymore. The morning air was as sharp as a razor. It cut right through my wool shawl, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was bleeding. I was Sarah Jane Miller. The truth was out. Silas knew. Martha knew. The lie had been a heavy coat I'd worn for too long, and now that it was off, I felt light. I felt cold, too. But it was a clean kind of cold. I was in the barn, helping Silas. We were checking the grain stores. He didn't treat me any different. He still pointed. He still expected me to keep up. But there was a softness in the way he handed me the lantern, a quiet acknowledgement that I was still there. Then we heard the carriage. It wasn't a ranch wagon. It was a fancy black brougham. It looked out of place in the mud of Rattlesnake Flats. It looked like Philadelphia. It looked like my past coming to collect a debt. A man stepped out. He was wearing a gray suit. He had a silk hat. He looked like a gentleman, but I knew better. I knew the way he carried his shoulders. I knew the way he tapped his cane against the ground. It was my brother, Thomas Miller. My heart didn't soar. It sank. It went right down into the dirt. "Sarah Jane," Thomas said. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile you see on a gambler who just drew an ace. "I've spent a fortune tracking you down. I thought you were dead, sister." I didn't move. I didn't run to him. I stayed right beside Silas. "I'm not your sister right now, Thomas," I said. "Right now, I'm a woman who is wondering how you found this ranch." Silas stepped forward. He didn't draw his gun, but he moved like a mountain shifting. He placed himself between me and the man in the suit. "You lost, mister?" Silas asked. Thomas looked Silas up and down. He didn't look impressed. He looked annoyed. "I'm here for my sister," Thomas said. "She's been involved in some legal misunderstandings. I'm here to take her home, to make things right." Silas didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on Thomas. "A person isn't a piece of luggage," Silas said. His voice was low. It was steady. "You don't just take someone because you share a last name. A human being has the right to choose their own path. They have the right to decide who their people are. Shared blood is a fact of nature, but shared loyalty is a choice of the spirit. And out here, we value the choice over the fact." Thomas laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "She's a fraud, man," Thomas spat. "She stole Abigail's identity. She's committed a crime. If you keep her here, you're an accomplice." I saw Caleb Vance's horse riding up behind the carriage. The wolf had found a way in. He'd hired my own brother to do his dirty work. "I know what she did," Silas said. He turned his head then, just enough to see me. "She lied to survive," Silas continued, speaking to Thomas but looking at me. "But she's been honest in every way that matters since she got here. She's worked. She's cared for this land. She's fought for justice against a thief in a badge. To judge a person solely by their worst mistake is to deny the possibility of growth. It is a violation of the basic human right to a second chance. Every person deserves the opportunity to outrun their past if they are willing to do the work in the present. Sarah Jane has done the work. That makes her more of a thorn than you'll ever be." Thomas's face went red. He looked at Caleb Vance, who was now dismounting. "She's coming with me," Thomas said. "I'm her legal guardian. She's mentally unfit. Look at her. She's living in a shack with savages." I stepped out from behind Silas. I was trembling, but my voice didn't fail me. "I am not unfit, Thomas," I said, "and I am not your property. You didn't come here because you love me. You came here because Vance promised you a cut of this land once I was out of the way. You're selling your own blood for a handful of silver, and that is the only crime I see here today." I looked at Caleb Vance. He was leaning against his saddle, watching the show. "The law is clear, Silas," Vance said. "The brother has the claim, unless, of course, you want to prove she's Abigail Thorne." Silas didn't answer. He just looked at Thomas. "Go," Silas said. "I'm not leaving without her," Thomas shouted. Silas took one step toward him. Just one. Thomas scrambled back toward his carriage. He nearly tripped over his own cane. "Listen to me," Silas said. "A man who betrays his own family for profit is a man who has no honor, and a man with no honor has no standing on this ranch. You have 5 minutes to turn that carriage around. After that, I stop talking. And you know what happens when I stop talking." Thomas looked at Vance. Vance shrugged. The deputy wasn't going to die for Thomas Miller. He was a predator, but he was a smart one. Thomas climbed back into the carriage. He didn't look at me. He was already thinking about his next move. The carriage rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust that smelled like betrayal. Silas watched them go. Then he turned to me. "You okay?" he asked. "He was my brother, Silas," I whispered. "He was all I had left in the world." Silas walked over. He didn't hug me. He just put his hand on my shoulder. It was heavy. It was solid. "No," Silas said. "He was the person you were born to, but he wasn't your brother. Not today. A brother is a person who protects your dignity, not a person who tries to auction it off. You lost a name today, Sarah Jane. But you didn't lose a family. Because family is built on respect. It's built on the truth. And we're still standing right here." I looked at the house. I saw Martha standing on the porch. She was holding a pot of coffee. She waved. I realized Silas was right. My brother hadn't come to save me. He had come to erase me. But these people, these strangers who had brought me a feast when I was starving, they were the ones who saw me. "Thank you, Silas," I said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just remember what I said. You have a right to be here. Not because of a will, not because of a lie, but because you are a person of value, and that is something no carriage and no lawyer can ever drive away." We went back to work. The sun was higher now. The frost was melting. The ground was wet and muddy, but it was firm. I was Sarah Jane Miller, and I was home. The fight wasn't over. It had just moved from the porch to the courthouse. Caleb Vance wasn't giving up. He had filed a motion to seize the Starthorn. He was claiming the inheritance was void because of the fraud. He was planning to take the whole ranch by the end of the week. We were in Uncle Jedediah's old study. It was a small room. It smelled of tobacco and old paper. Silas was sitting at the desk. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was used to fighting things he could see: wolves, storms, drought. He wasn't used to fighting words on a page. "There has to be something," I said. I was going through the desk. Again. My photographic memory was playing every image of the room back to me. I remembered the way the light hit the drawers. I remembered the slight tilt of the inkwell. "Vance has the judge in his pocket," Silas said. "It doesn't matter what the books say if the man on the bench won't read them." "Law and justice aren't always the same thing, Silas," I said. I stopped. I looked at the bottom of the heavy oak desk. There was a seam. It was thin, thinner than a hair. But I remembered it. I remembered seeing it the first day I arrived when I was too hungry to care. "Help me move this," I said. Silas stood up. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed one side of the desk and I grabbed the other. We shifted it a few inches. I knelt down. I pressed a small wooden knot near the floor. There was a click. A shallow drawer slid out from the very bottom of the desk. Inside was a single envelope. It was yellowed. It had Jedediah's handwriting on the front. "To the woman who comes for the feast." My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened it. Silas leaned over my shoulder. His breath was warm against my neck. "Read it," he said. I did. It wasn't a legal document. Not at first. It was a letter. "If you are reading this," it began, "it means you found the hidden drawer. It means you have the eyes to see what others miss. I knew Abigail Thorne. I knew she was a sickly girl with a mother who wouldn't let her breathe the Texas air. I knew she'd likely never make the trip. But I also knew that the Starthorn would need someone with a backbone. Someone who understood what it meant to be empty and still keep walking. I stopped, my eyes blurred. Silas put his hand on the back of my chair. "I'm leaving 40% of this ranch to whoever shows up in Abigail's name. I don't care if it's her or a stranger from the docks. If a woman has the courage to travel 1,000 miles to a land she doesn't know, pretending to be someone she isn't just to find a life, then she is the woman this ranch needs. A legacy isn't about blood. It's about the spirit. It's about the right of the brave to inherit the earth. Silas is the heart of this place. But he needs a mind. He needs a partner who knows the value of a feast, because she's known the sting of the famine." I looked at Silas. He was staring at the letter. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He knew, Silas whispered. He didn't just know, I said. He planned it. He wanted to make sure that the land didn't just go to a relative. He wanted it to go to someone who needed it, someone who would value it. I turned the page. There was a formal codicil. It was signed. It was witnessed by a circuit judge from 3 counties over. A man Vance couldn't touch. We have it, I said, the legal right. We rode into town the next morning. We didn't go to Vance's office. We went straight to the town hall. The room was full. Vance was there looking smug. Thomas was there looking greedy. The judge was sitting up high looking bored. This is a simple matter of fraud, Vance told the room. The woman is an imposter. The inheritance is forfeit. I stood up. I didn't wait for permission. I walked to the front of the room. I held Jedediah's letter in my hand like it was a holy relic. Identity is a shell, I said. My voice was loud. It was rhythmic. It was the voice of a teacher who knew the lesson was important. You think you can take this land because a name was whispered wrong, but justice is not a game of spelling. It is a commitment to the truth of a man's intent. The judge looked down at me. And what was his intent, young lady? His intent was to honor the right of the individual, I said. I looked at the crowd. I saw the ranchers. I saw the shopkeepers. I saw the people who had been squeezed by Vance for years. Jedediah Thorne believed that a person's worth is not a fixed thing determined at birth, I continued. He believed in the humanitarian value of the second chance. He believed that the law should be a tool to empower the resilient, not a trap to enrich the greedy. He left this land to the woman who comes for the feast, because he understood that the most qualified person for a job is often the one who has had to fight the hardest to get to the door. To invalidate this will is to say that a person's past is a prison they can never escape. It is to say that we are all just labels on a shelf. But we are more than that. We are our actions. We are our choices. And Jedediah chose me. I handed the letter and the codicil to the judge. Vance stepped forward. He tried to grab it. Silas moved. He didn't hit him. He just stepped into his path. It was enough. The judge read the letter. He read it twice. He looked at the signature of the circuit judge. He looked at Caleb Vance. This is highly unusual, the judge said. It's highly Texas, Silas said from the back of the room. The judge gave a small, dry smile. He hit his gavel. The codicil is valid, the judge announced. The intent of the deceased is clear. The property remains with Mr. Thorne and Miss Miller. The fraud charges are dismissed, as the deceased explicitly invited the deception as a test of character. Vance's face went white. Thomas slumped in his chair. I felt a wave of relief so strong I thought I might fall over, but then I felt Silas's hand on my arm. He was there. He was always there. We walked out of the courthouse. The sun was shining on the street. It was a new day. You did it, Silas said. We did it, I said. We stood on the boardwalk. I looked at the town. It didn't look so scary anymore. Silas, I said, why didn't you just let Vance take me? It would have been easier. You could have kept the whole ranch for yourself once the dust settled. Silas stopped. He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time. Because a man who stands by while a woman is robbed of her dignity is a man who doesn't deserve to own an inch of dirt, Silas said. He took a breath. He looked at the horizon. Listen to me, Sarah Jane, he said. The legal system is just a set of rules we wrote down to keep from killing each other. But moral justice? That's something else. That's the belief that every person has an inherent value that no law can override. If I had let him take you, I would have been saying that your life didn't matter. I would have been saying that the feast I brought you was just a lie. And I don't lie, not about the important things. He reached out and took my hand. His skin was rough. It was warm. You saved the ranch, he said. But you saved me, too. You reminded me that words have power. You reminded me that we don't just live on the land. We live for the truth. I looked at our joined hands. "I think I'm ready to see that lavender bloom," I said. "It'll be 2 years," Silas reminded me. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. We rode back to the Starthorn. The feast was waiting for us. But it wasn't just ham and honey anymore. It was a life. It was a name. It was the truth. And the truth was the best meal I'd ever had. The Texas spring didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a shout. It was March 1879. The brown, bruised world of winter was gone. In its place was a sea of green so bright it hurt the eyes. The bluebonnets were starting to peek through the tall grass. The air didn't bite anymore. It smelled of damp earth and blooming sage. I stood on the porch of the Starthorn. I looked at the mailbox at the end of the long dirt drive. Silas had repainted it yesterday, Thorn and Miller. It was a small thing, a bit of white paint on a wooden box. But to me it was a monument. It was the first time my true name had ever been written down as something that belonged. Silas was down by the corral. He was working a new colt. He moved with that same steady, quiet rhythm. But he didn't look like a statue anymore. He looked like a man who was breathing with the land, not just surviving it. I walked down the steps. I headed toward the old tack room. Silas had spent the last month turning it into a schoolhouse. He'd scrubbed the walls. He'd built 6 small benches. He'd even found an old chalkboard in Abilene and hauled it back in the wagon. Today was the first day. 7 children were already there. They were the sons and daughters of the neighboring ranchers, the ones who had been too afraid of Caleb Vance to speak up, but were now eager to see their children learn. I stepped inside. The room smelled of fresh cedar and ink. "Good morning," I said. The children looked up. They were quiet. They were curious. They saw a woman in a simple calico dress with her hair tied back. They didn't see an imposter. They saw a teacher. I picked up a piece of chalk. I wrote my name on the board, Miss Miller. "Before we start with the alphabet," I told them, "we are going to talk about why we are here. Knowledge is not just a collection of facts. It is not something you memorize to look smart at a Sunday social. Knowledge is a human right. It is the tool that ensures no man can ever pull the wool over your eyes. When you can read the law for yourself, when you can balance your own ledgers, you are free. Education is the foundation of true equality. It ensures that the power in this world stays in the hands of the many, not the greed of the few." I looked at a young boy in the front row. His hands were dirty. His boots were worn. "You have a right to understand the world you live in," I said, "and I am here to make sure you have the words to defend your place in it." The door creaked. Silas was standing there. He had a crate in his arms. He walked in and set it on my desk. "Found these in town," he said. "It was books, primers, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, a book of poetry." "Thank you, Silas," I said. He didn't leave. He stood by the door for a minute, watching the children. Then he looked at me. "They look ready," he said. "They are," I said. He gave me that small ghost of a nod and walked back out into the sun. I taught for 4 hours. My throat was dry, my back was tired, but my soul was full. When the children left, running across the yard toward their horses, I sat down on one of the small benches. Silas came back a few minutes later. He sat down on the bench next to me. He looked too big for the furniture. It made me smile. "You did a good thing here, Sarah Jane," he said. "We did," I said. We sat in silence for a while. The sun was leaning toward the west. The light was turning gold. "I was thinking about what you said to Vance," Silas said. "Which part?" "About the feast," he said. He looked at the chalkboard. "About how I brought you food when you were starving. You said it was a commitment to the truth of a man's intent." I waited. "I didn't just bring you ham and honey because I'm a good man," Silas said. He looked at his hands. "I brought it because I was starving too. I had plenty of meat in the smokehouse. I had plenty of wood for the fire. But I didn't have a reason to sit at the table. I was a man who had closed his heart because I thought love was a transaction. I thought if I didn't give anything, I couldn't lose anything." He turned to look at me. His eyes were the clearest I had ever seen them. "Listen to me, Sarah Jane," Silas said. Love is not a debt. It is not something you owe someone because they were kind to you. It is a shared recognition of humanity. It is the decision to say, I see you, I respect you, and I will stand with you against the cold. That is the real feast. The food was just an invitation. The staying, that was the meal. He took a breath. I stayed because you reminded me that a person's dignity is worth more than their history, he continued. You showed me that a man who only loves the dirt is a man who is half dead. We have built this ranch on honest ground now, not because the law says so, but because we chose to be honest with each other, and that is the only way a life can truly grow. I reached out and took his hand. I thought I was a coward for lying, I whispered. No, Silas said, you were a survivor, and now you're a builder. There's a difference. We walked out of the schoolhouse together. Martha was on the porch, ringing the bell for supper. We walked toward the house. The air was cooling down. The stars were starting to wake up. Silas, I said. Yeah? I planted that lavender today, behind the house near the well. He stopped. He looked at the patch of dark earth I had worked. 2 years, he said. I know, I said. You think we'll be here to see it? I looked at the star thorn. I looked at the schoolhouse. I looked at the mailbox with our names on it. I think we'll be here for the lavender, I said, and the roses, and whatever else we decide to plant. Silas didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the land. Then he looked at me. Every human being has an inherent right to a home, Silas said. He spoke it like a law. It isn't just about the roof over your head or the deed in the drawer. A home is the place where you don't have to explain your existence. It's the place where your truth is enough. I spent 40 years looking for that place. I think I finally found the gate. Me too, Silas, I said. We went inside. The house was warm. The kitchen smelled of beef stew and fresh bread. Martha was at the table. She had 3 plates set. About time, Martha said. We sat down. Silas picked up the bread. He broke it in half and gave the first piece to me. To honest ground, he said. To honest ground, I replied. I looked at the window. The reflection of the candle showed a woman I finally recognized. She wasn't Abigail. She wasn't a starving girl. She was Sarah Jane Miller, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The winter was over. The lie was gone. The feast had begun, and this time, it was never going to end. I took a bite of the bread. It was warm. It was real. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was home. On this channel, you'll find emotional Western stories about cowboys, frontier love, motherly sacrifice, compassion, forgiveness, and the deep bonds between human hearts. If you enjoyed this tale, kindly like, comment your thoughts, share it with fellow Western story lovers, and subscribe for more touching stories from the frontier. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
As we come to the end of Sarah Jane Miller's journey, we are reminded that the harshest winters are not always made of snow and wind. Sometimes, the coldest places are found inside a hungry heart, inside a lonely room, or inside a life where a person has been told they are worth nothing because they have nothing. Sarah Jane began this story with an empty stomach, a stolen name, and a desperate fear that the world had no place left for her. Yet through the kindness of Martha, the quiet strength of Silas Thorne, and her own courage to finally speak the truth, she discovered something far greater than land, money, or inheritance. She discovered dignity. She learned that poverty is not a shame, survival is not a sin, and a human being's value cannot be measured by the mistakes they made when they were starving, frightened, and alone. This story teaches us that compassion can change the course of a life. A plate of food, a warm fire, a hand on the shoulder, or a simple refusal to abandon someone can become the beginning of healing. Silas did not save Sarah Jane by treating her as weak. Martha did not comfort her by pretending the lie did not matter. They helped her because they saw the person beneath the fear. They understood that every soul deserves food, safety, respect, and a second chance. And Sarah Jane, in return, proved that when a wounded person is given trust, they can become a protector, a builder, and a light for others. Her sharp mind saved the ranch, but her honesty saved herself. The deeper meaning of this tale is that home is not merely a roof, a deed, or a name painted on a mailbox. Home is the place where your truth is allowed to stand without apology. It is the place where you no longer have to hide your hunger, your grief, your past, or your scars. Sarah Jane came to the Starthorn Ranch as an imposter, but she stayed as herself, and that is the real victory of this Western story. Not that she won land, not that she defeated a corrupt man, but that she finally looked at her own reflection and recognized a woman worthy of love, respect, and belonging. So may this story leave us with one lasting lesson. Never judge a person only by the road they took to survive. Look instead at what they do when they are finally given the chance to stand in the light. Some people lie because they are cruel, but some lie because the world has given them no safe place to tell the truth. Mercy does not excuse every wrong, but it does create the space where truth can finally breathe. And when truth is met with compassion, broken people can become whole again. If Sarah Jane's journey touched your heart, carry its message with you. Feed the hungry, protect the vulnerable, honor honest work, forgive those who are trying to change, and never forget that every human being deserves a place at the table. Thank you for listening to this Western tale of courage, kindness, justice, and homecoming. May we all find our own honest ground, and may we all become the kind of people who help others find theirs.